and Cara Tuttle Bell, both of them. If you participated in the earlier one on training for staff, presented the materials there, as well as for many of you who participated last summer in the One Student program, they were a part of that team that brought us that fantastic program for our campuses to use. So they should look familiar to those of you who participated in that. We're so thankful to have them here and thankful for their time for, this is now the fourth workshop over the past 2 weeks or week and a half, really. And I just really appreciate the time and effort and expertise in helping our campuses here in Ohio. So thank you, Amy and Cara, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. I want to acknowledge as we are about to begin, and as we speak a lot in this field about the power of words, and we're going to talk about dialogue today, I think it's important to acknowledge what's been happening in the nation and around the world, particularly in the last 10 days, and some of the difficult dialogue many of us have been a part of or have been watching play out in other ways. This session was planned many months ago, and as Carrie said, is being recorded, for which I'm thankful, as I recognize some of you listening may be tired today, or there may be folks who opted not to dial in because of the heavy days that have been upon us. And so we just want to acknowledge the context of what's happening outside of this space, not lost on me with relation to what we're going to be talking about today. And then the focus of today's conversation is about communications in the context of the spectrum of sexual violence and our response to changing campus culture. But as with everything we do, that effort doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so do want to acknowledge all that's going on in response to the killing of George Floyd, the demonstrations, and the loss of so many other Black lives in recent years, and in particular highlighted in recent weeks. And so do want to take a moment to pause with that. Our hope today is we're going to provide a broad overview and fairly quick overview about what makes dialogue difficult. We're going to frame that in the context of key points of interaction in all of the work that we do, but in particular regard to some of the requirements that are outlined in the recent Title IX regulations that many of us are working on. How do we adapt our procedures to comply with those regulations? Then we're going to talk about some strategies for approaching difficult dialogue, and in particular focusing on those things we can control. What is our response and our within our purview to control in what we know is a difficult process. When we do everything right, we'll sometimes not make anyone happy in the process, as well as highlighting some strategies for receiving and processing difficult dialogue. Those of you who have worked with Cara and I before or seen us present before know that we both pretty proudly geek out on some of the theory and research in the field and trying to take theory and research and applying it to practice. So we will be presenting some examples of some models that we have found to be helpful and think folks might find useful to explore, as well as talking about some of the key points or takeaways that might be helpful to take back to the teams that you work with and apply in practice on your campuses. So when we're talking about difficult dialogue, just beginning with dialogue is communication, written or verbal. It's an exchange between two or more people, and communication involves imparting or exchanging information. And what we really want to focus on today is effective communication, which is more than just an exchange of information. It includes the awareness of and attending to emotions and intentions or other factors that might impede information being exchanged or being received fully. So in that vein, talking about barriers to effective communication, not surprisingly, stress and emotion, whether related to the conversation or external factors, And a lack of focus by one or more individual involved can certainly impede effective communication. And it's also important to pay attention to inconsistent or negative body language, how we bring ourselves into a conversation physically, or the space in which we are having a conversation can convey messages, sometimes unintended messages. So I pause here to say these points in particularly the first two, stress and emotion and a lack of focus, are inherent in all of the work that we do. Communication related to disclosures of sexual violence or needing to respond as a respondent or a witness in such a matter are just inherently stressful and emotional in nature. And the fact that we're working on campuses and work environments is also that there are going to be distractions, and this just the need to have a conversation can be overwhelming. I think that's important to acknowledge that these are barriers to effective communication, and yet we know it's a part of our work to expect those barriers, and that's where some preparation can help in addressing what we know are going to be barriers to try and reduce or eliminate barriers where we can. Some tips to think about: obviously keeping stress in check for ourselves and for others. And so thinking about, while we can't control someone else's emotion, there are some things we can do to minimize stress when we communicate. Inviting someone to come in and speak to us, the more information or framing we can provide can reduce the stress level, what it looks and feels like when people arrive to our office, a number of ways that we can at least acknowledge that there may be stress that is a result of this communication, as well as acknowledging there may be stress beyond that. It helps to set clear expectations and frame the purpose of any exchange that we're having, and to be sure that we're engaging in active listening when we're talking through or meeting at any point in our process. Paying attention to our nonverbal communication, both our own and other folks. Certainly, I find it more challenging as we're presenting here in a virtual setting. There's different things that might grab your attention and can be more apparent if you get distracted and you're having an online communication as opposed to when in person with folks. So thinking about what are the factors that might interfere with communication and anticipating some of those things is always an important element of effective communication. And we talked a little bit about considering the environment. Certainly when we're on campus, folks talk a lot about, do you have a comfortable place to sit that isn't across your desk? It's not dissimilar in a virtual setting, as we know many of us might need to continue working virtually for the foreseeable future. So thinking about what your setup is, what the background is, maybe asking those questions of the person you're communicating with to find out what their environment may be. And finding some ways to assist, whether it's having patience if someone needs to set up a headset because the audio isn't working well for them, but thinking about the environmental controls that can assist with effective communication. And now more than ever, making sure that we are supporting any dialogue with follow-up. That we're supporting our spoken word with written word and how we're sharing that information. We want to make sure there's congruence between what we're delivering and how it's being delivered. Thinking about materials that we share, the accessibility of those materials, or even our dialogue. Is there an accessibility question? Am I speaking too quickly? Do I have a poor connection? And so audio is coming and going. Might we need to address those sorts of things? If there might be language barriers, is there a mechanism to connect with a translator or identify other tools that would be helpful? And when we're delivering information, again, whether written or verbally, thinking about what are the most important takeaways and where are we placing the emphasis, both intentionally and unintentionally, but certainly thinking about how we wrap information, how we remind people of the key things to take away. All of these are tools that can be used for effective communication. I expect none of what I've shared thus far is new. but is a summary to begin us in thinking about what it means to engage in effective communication and the importance of some pre-planning to set ourselves up to then have both literally and figuratively the energy for that difficult dialogue in the moment. We're going to talk quite a bit today about the actual exchange of communication in dialogue, and we're going to highlight for you some of the points where we know there's going to be points of difficult dialogue, and then we're going to shift gears and really talk about what are the points that we can control, which really comes down to what can we do to prepare ourselves so that we can be fully present in such an exchange. A lot of information shared, and so as we will do several times today, we'll take a brief pause. The hope for today's conversation is that we really can center the conversation around what are our needs as individuals and as teams who are doing this difficult work that we recognize as difficult, and how we can bring that into assisting us in approaching what we know are going to be difficult exchanges. But when we plan for what we know, it makes it a little bit easier, or at least we manage a little bit easier some of those difficulties.
Breathing is so important. It's important for self-regulation. It also buys us some time. And I urge you to think of it like public speaking, where when we're taking the pause for the breath, it often feels longer than it is. So you can absolutely apply this to meetings and less formal dialogues as well. When I started incorporating intentional breathing into my day, just at least taking a breath if I couldn't review some notes or prep for a meeting, my days felt easier and my conversations went more smoothly. There's a lot of evidence about mindfulness and being present. So thank you, Amy, for that breathing break. It helps me launch into my material, and I encourage you to incorporate those practices when and where you can. Given our work responding to sexual harassment, sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, whether you're in student conduct or you're doing prevention, there are a lot of opportunities for tension points in the conversations that we have throughout our days and throughout our calls and throughout our nights. And so we're highlighting several on these next two slides, but it's not an exhaustive list. We know there will be other conversations, some of which we anticipate, some of which surprise us, and we just want to review those here just so we're thinking about them. We can at least do some planning and some preparation during today's talk. If not, hopefully also we can find some time during our hectic days and future staff meetings and trainings. So the initial reach out after receiving a complaint is in of itself important. For years at an institution where I worked, we would send an official looking email that used all caps. We were trying to grab the student's attention in their email box. Email is the official communication at my institution, and so we did this with very good intentions, but we heard from students that even that formatting, well, it did get their attention, but it prompted anxiety as soon as they saw it. And so it was creating some fear and apprehension, and we softened our language and we softened the capitalization to be more sensitive for anyone who's involved, for witnesses, for complainants and respondents receiving a correspondence from one of those offices. You might have insufficient information to move forward based on the initial complaint or those initial conversations, and that might be tough news to deliver. Some people come in with high expectations of taking action. Whether or not we're able to put much of the narrative together, a number of the incidents that impacted our campuses involve alcohol, which can impair the recollection of those involved, whether it's, the sometimes we have complainants who can't recall much of the evening. They just know sometimes where they woke up the next day, but they believe the witnesses are going to provide enough information to go on, and so there can be disappointment, there can be doubt and disbelief, and you just don't have enough to go on, and these are really real situations we find ourselves in, and so it can be tough to relay that information. Or you do have enough information to go on, and then you have to begin establishing connections with the parties that you're going to need to speak to, and that's going to be stressful for them, regardless of their role. And maybe they did our compliance modules, maybe they attended orientation, and they have some idea that we have these processes and procedures, but it's a different matter altogether to find yourself playing a role, and a role that has specific expectations and rights and responsibilities. And so we should be prepared again to walk them through that information. Sometimes our parties request supportive or interim measures. We are obligated to provide those very clearly in the new regulations. Many of us want to provide those, but sometimes those requests are unreasonable or impossible for us to provide the way that the people want them, and that can be a tough conversation. Parties sometimes drop out or don't reply at all, and we can only proceed on the information we have. Sometimes the CSI effect, or what they think we're able to collect from a dorm room or from video footage that we may have, is not showing what they hoped it would and thought it would. And so we might find ourselves even in the middle, unable to proceed or unable to generate sufficient evidence to weigh then in proceeding. And so we just have an outcome that's out of reach based on the information we have, and that can be disappointing or devastating for the people involved. I know that this is really tough on my campus. We do not require students to participate as witnesses in the procedures on my campus. Sometimes students want us to, sometimes parents want us to, and sometimes, you know, it's entirely possible that we have a sober eyewitness who just refuses to come in. And that's really tough news to deliver, that our witnesses aren't participating, or that they did participate and they didn't provide the information that either the complainant or respondent student had hoped. These investigations can be very tough. They can take some time. We could have a well-being issue on the part of one or more of the parties. There are a number of reasons we might experience delays. Delays in the student world end up being a significant portion of their undergraduate or graduate experience, and so that news can be tough to deliver. So we're called on many times to disappoint someone in the process, and I hope that we can embrace these as challenges, that we've taken on tough work worth doing, but it's really important to consider the many points that can be fraught or invite conflict or stress in the process. And so we can go on to the next slide, please. Here are some more. Warnings about retaliation. So many of us, hopefully all of us, have policies that advise our community members that retaliation is prohibited. In years past, this has been a statement in our policies, but perhaps we didn't have a proactive anti-retaliation plan or programming, and maybe you haven't fleshed that out on your campuses, but we need to issue strong warnings of retaliation, because feelings run really high around matters of sexual misconduct, and rightfully so, but we want to guide our community members into constructively supporting those who've been impacted, including respondents who find themselves going through a very stressful process for them. And we want them to have a support network, but we want that support to stop short of harming or intimidating or discouraging others from participating in the process. We don't want the friends, the student organizations, the teams, the fraternities, the sororities to get themselves in trouble following an incident because they're engaged in retaliation. So here is an area where we need to be firm and we need to be clear. And we also might have to explain that everything that they think is retaliation may not rise to the level of retaliation under our policies. And so that can be hard to parse out for those involved. Obviously, the finding, that's something people know is going to be difficult. I hear regularly people that work in student conduct or sometimes in HR or the Equal Opportunity Office, people who are responsible for delivering the finding, writing those reports, or issuing the sanctions, know that on those days they're going to have someone who is perhaps not satisfied, who is not happy, who doesn't feel like justice has been served. And so those are challenging moments, certainly. You might have to defend your findings or your sanctions, and you might need to do that conversationally. You might need to do that in written word in reports. You might need to do that in the appeals process. Sometimes we'll be called on, and we have to be careful with this, but sometimes we'll be called on to offer interim measures or supportive measures that are going to restrict or negatively impact one of the parties. And we'll have to explain why we're choosing to do that. And you need to explain that balancing act that we're asked to do. We need to do those fairly, but there are certainly times for the safety of our community when we're asked to do that, and delivering that information and explaining why we did that. To the students involved, to the faculty and staff, to parents, to coaches, sometimes to media, is sometimes asked of us. And that leads us into media scrutiny. I've worked on campuses where we had a high-profile incident. We had camera crews just showing up on campus and talking to anyone who would talk to them. If your high-profile incident results in both your procedural and criminal action, you could have a sustained period of local media scrutiny and inquiry. This can be really, really challenging, right? Because, and we have a good graphic for you coming later, we have the overlap of a number of laws and our own policies at play. Those policies and procedures should protect the privacy of those involved. You also then just have your institutional stance on how much information you do or do not share with others. That can leave people wanting more. That can leave people thinking that a lack of transparency or those privacy protections means that you or your institution are hiding something. And so this is, particularly if it's being recorded, a situation where you're going to want to choose your words carefully. These are difficult dialogues that then get put in print or shown to your broader community. And that can be really challenging and really stressful for us. And so those moments for pausing to take a breath and urging you to engage in practices of self-care, definitely recommend that when you're going to be facing interviews and write-ups by the media, certainly. And sometimes we have coaches, faculty members, influential parents, board members who want to call you and believe that they might be able to use the influence they hold because of their position to urge you to act more swiftly or to make a certain decision. Hopefully, you have the support of those in your community, your supervisors, your structure to guard against that. But if you find yourself on the other end of the phone explaining to a person why you need to defend the integrity of your process and that all of those involved are entitled to the fairness and justice of those procedures, having some talking points and some preparation can be really meaningful, because you also, we know, are going to try to preserve that relationship with, our friends and colleagues. These are going to vary by campus and by person and by phone call and by meeting, and we realize that. And so we hope with the tools that we're going to cover shortly, you have something that you can apply to those different scenarios.
So on the screen are some simple statements that are not intended to oversimplify the ongoing attention that's necessary in the difficult conversations that are inherent in our work. Truly, 10% of what happens to us is then becomes 90% of our energy or how we react to it. It really is, it sounds so simple to say if we can just pause and respond rather than reacting. That's a crucial part of effective communication. Some of you may recall, and I date myself in using this one, but Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, there's a point where he talks about between every circumstance and our response is the moment where we choose how to respond. And in our practices, the work that we do, we put a lot of effort into thinking about our preparation and what our processes are, anticipating the needs and impact of individuals who we may be serving or supporting, and the crisis planning that is a part of a lot of higher ed, and particularly those of us who may have some overlap with behavioral intervention and threat assessment. Those are tools for preparation that are essential to being prepared for the many things that may come our way. But as the quote on the far right indicates, we can't control other people's behavior or feelings, but we can control our reaction. And so where we want to refocus for a bit of this conversation is thinking about ourselves, that whether you know that you've got some good measures in place with your planning and your preparation for crisis response and how you explain your process, put that aside and think more individually at this point, or looking within. As I mentioned earlier, Cara and I both like to look to the research and tend to dig deep and then want to share with others what we've learned and what we found to be helpful. And so we're each going to share a couple of communication models that we found to be helpful in doing this work. But again, the framing of this is about our individual use of them. So some of what we're sharing might resonate with you and you might want to know more. Please throw some questions into the chat box if you have them. And some of you might hear what we're saying and feel like it just isn't resonating, and that's okay. There's a whole lot more in the way of communication models available that we don't highlight here. But we just wanted to, I find it helpful and think that it's helpful to remind, just as we talk about pausing to take a breath, is pausing to think about our own self-care. And for me, part of taking care of myself is, what am I doing to prepare myself for the difficult things that I do every day? Sometimes that can be the, I'm going to wear some bling today because I want to look good because that's going to help me do good things, or I know this is going to be a rough week, so I've already got something lined up for who I'm spending time with or who I'm not spending time with this weekend. Those are all elements of self-care, but thinking about in the moment, what can we do in those difficult exchanges to help attend to our own stress and our own emotion, or recognize when it's something that we have control over. So one of the models that I have read about a number of times over the years, and a number of folks may see some similarity in this, or may recognize that the nonviolent communication work of Marshall Rosenberg is often associated with restorative practices and some of the work that's being done on campuses with regard to courageous dialogue and those sorts of things. But essentially the premise of nonviolent communication is to really help us think about how we're speaking with others and how we're hearing beyond just the words that are being shared, and that can empower us to relate better to ourselves and to the others with whom we're communicating. In particular, nonviolent communication focuses on thinking about those moments when we're feeling reactive to something. And it can be a kind of typically mundane exchange that you have a roommate and you come home and there's dishes in the sink and it just sets you off. And where did that come from is that moment of reflection. And when we think about where are those points that we are reactive, it is often related to either unmet needs or a values conflict. And in some of the materials that you received, there's a web link for nonviolent communication, or you can Google nonviolent communication needs and values, and there's lists of words that if you're reflecting on an exchange that you walked away from it and it just, oh, I got so mad at that exchange and I don't know why it bothered me so much, but clearly 3 days later, I'm still thinking about it. Sometimes looking at those lists of needs, emotions, or values can help to figure out what is it that we're feeling, or what is it that's creating some dissonance for us. So then we can unpack and figure out what might have been an unmet need in that exchange, or what did I value that's not being honored right now. I know in the work that we do around sexual violence, there are often exchanges where We are following policy, and we know that we can't do what the person sitting in front of us would like us to do. As Cara referred to earlier, some requests are just unreasonable, and yet we recognize the pain of the person who is sitting with us, and we wish there's something more we could do. There are moments where there's a values piece in there. Sometimes it's just hard. We do hard work, and Glennon Doyle says we can do hard things. But sometimes it's a values thing that we even advocated in our policy or procedures writing to do more than where we landed. Sometimes others who are a part of that process, we land somewhere short of where we personally wish we could have gotten. And yet it's our job to do what we say we're going to do, what's written in our policy and procedure. So that can often be about a values issue where something's not being honored. And so that's what's really creating the issue. Maybe not even the words that were being exchanged. It's how we feel about that need not being met. An example of unmet needs in the moment can also be where, again, I draw on things that I don't think I'm alone in having experienced in the work that we do, where we've jumped through hoops and made lots of calls and really advocated for a student to make exceptions to help them get an extension on their assignment or whatever assistance that really we did a lot to make it happen. And then we're sitting with that person and they're not acknowledging that they got what they asked for. They're now mad about something else. And I think most of us professionally know that you've got to hold it together for that, and that happens to us. But that's where sometimes that nonviolent communication of recognizing what I'm angry about is I didn't get some need met. But when I realize that, then I go, oh, yeah, see, that was about me, and I really do want this not to be about me, or it doesn't need to be about me, or I really just need to be validated. And so I know who my person is that I pick up the phone and say, can I just tell you this and make sure I didn't miss something? Because then we get that need met, which can also then help us let go of that tension we may be feeling. So I think in addition to nonviolent communication and what I'm describing, I think for most of the communication models that we are discussing or presenting here is it's a part of the reflection that we do when we are in the midst of or just coming out of a difficult exchange. Do we create the space for ourselves to think back on how can I review my contributions and learn something or let go of something so that this doesn't keep playing over and over for me? So if you're not familiar with nonviolent communication, I encourage you to look up and you may find that to be helpful. The second model that I wanted to share is actually referred to as the model. Brooke Castillo, who is a life coach and an entrepreneur, she runs a podcast. So if you Google Brooke Castillo, the model, you'll find her podcast link and hear her talk for 20 or 25 minutes about presenting the model. This is really an empowerment model, and it sounds very simple, but basically saying that circumstances lead to thoughts, that lead to feelings, that lead to actions that get us to our results. And the important point in here is oftentimes when we're feeling an emotion, a reaction, we describe it as I'm reacting to the circumstances. And what her model unpacks is, in reality, in most cases, if we think about the circumstances, or typically that's what something said, the words that someone actually said to us, those are the circumstances. Factually, these are the words that were said. But the way I think about those words is what creates my feelings and leads to actions that can influence the results. And if I can stop and look back at the circumstances, what were those actual words that were said? And maybe I need to also think about the context. It wasn't just the words, it's that those words were said in front of my boss or in front of a student. So then my thoughts about those words are what I got mad at, because I thought, how dare they say that in front of my boss? I'm so mad because they said that, when in actuality, it wasn't what they said, it's where they said it or how they said it. And more importantly, it's what I thought about it. When we can take ownership of, we have the ability to create those thoughts, we can change those thoughts. So if we can think about, we have a colleague who consistently gives feedback in front of other people, which feels like it's undermining. When I realize that the way I think about it is automatically to think that there they go, undermining me again. If I pause and think, have I ever brought it to their attention that the feedback they're giving is being provided in a setting that feels like it's undermining to me? Or if I don't have that kind of relationship or don't think I can have that conversation, I can also change my thoughts to say, wow, they're saying that in this setting that makes it look like they're undermining me. And I'm pretty sure the other people in the room see that. So how we think about the circumstance is really what drives our feelings and our actions, which can impact results. So again, Brooke Castillo and the model is what you can Google, and the links are also in the material that we've provided to you. I found this one to be really helpful for circumstances where I feel like it's come up again and again, and I can't quite figure out what it is. Brooke Castillo's website actually has a handout where you can actually write things in, because for some people, writing it out and looking at it on paper helps to get to what is it that I'm thinking. Like I can get from the circumstance to the feeling, but it might take me a little time to figure out what is the thought that's really driving that feeling and how do I change that thought? And that's where there is the empowerment, because the thoughts are mine, and so I get to choose doing them differently. So two different models that both have, I think, some value in reflecting on what we can control and how we can control things, as well as recognizing some points that may be beyond our control, which then allows us to let go of it. If I know I can't change it, then sometimes it's easier to let it go. So I will pause there and hand it over to Cara to present a couple of additional models.
So the next few models are shifting our perspective from us as anticipating a tough conversation to really thinking about the person sitting or listening on the other side. And if you're on this webinar, then we anticipate having tough or difficult dialogues with some regularity. And depending on who is coming in for which meeting, this might not be something that they are prepared to do or experienced in. And so what I like about what you're looking at here, which is a diagram that enables empathy mapping, is it's asking us to consider the person that we're talking to, or the person we need to relay information to, and have that interaction. And that's really often the tougher spot to be in. And so we've talked about listening, but listening is really key, not listening to reply, but listening to hear. People need to feel heard. It is painful not to feel heard. It also impedes their comprehension of what we need them to take away from the conversation, and it hinders them being proactive in taking steps that consist of some behavior change that we're asking for often in our meetings. And so what you're looking at here, there are different diagrams for this, but they're based on the original, which is, funnily enough, called the Big Head model. So if you Google empathy mapping Big Head, you'll get a diagram that looks like the one that is at the upper right hand corner, but there are some different ones. And I really find the Big Head model to be useful in staff meetings or trainings. And we're going to give you some scenarios. I think you have those in the PDF materials, and we won't cover all of those today, but I encourage you to take one of these models or all of them and work through some of those scenarios to help you shift from our own apprehension about the conversations that our roles ask of us, and really put us in the shoes and in the thoughts of the person sitting or listening from the other side. And it's going to ask you to consider nonverbals, both yours, but also reading theirs. And there's nothing about any of these models that prohibits you from bringing in other cultural competency training or unconscious bias training that you may have. In fact, you should, right? So if we're considering all of the things that bring forth the person that we're communicating to and what might be shaping the way that they're responding to us or hearing us, then that's absolutely part of it. We can't treat all people the same, and we have to meet people where they are. And the more you do this mapping, the more it can become a habit. And I don't have time to do it before every single meeting. Certainly, I'm not pretending that you all do, but the exercise can be useful. The diagram can be useful. So I have a little version of this taped up in my office, and it's something that I can see that they can't see, that can remind me in particularly tough moments to take that breath and to think about, what is it that they are hearing? What is it that they are seeing? What is their pain point? What do I want them to take away from this conversation? So these come from design thinking, and if you do some Googling, you're going to see that it's about selling a product, and often we're not selling a product, but we are asked, or we can be better at our jobs if we think of it as providing customer service. And so empathy mapping is one that's been really useful for me and my team, and I supervise a team of victim advocates on my campus, and you may be surprised, maybe not, about how much we get yelled at, even though we are victim advocates. I don't even have to make those tough findings or deliver those bad news or deliver any sanctions anymore. I did spend some time in student conduct many years ago, but we often are on the receiving end of a lot of pain, of some anger. I don't know if parents call you regularly on your campus, but they are very involved in the lives of our students, both undergraduate and graduate on my campus. And I try to route the parent phone calls to me so that my victim advocates can have that individual relationship with the student. And my most successful tactic with those particular calls do call for empathy and call for me to listen. Their child has gone through something or is going through something very stressful, and they want to be heard, and they want to know that someone cares. Certainly, my team and I care. This is the work that we chose, but they don't know that when they're calling. And so if they land with me, really pulling from the models that Amy just described, knowing that it is not about me, they don't know me as a person, they don't see the work that my team and I do, that it's really about where they're sitting. So put them in that, round face you've got at the top right of your screen here, and have some compassion for them. And a lot of the angst and the conflict that they're bringing in can be solved by truly listening on those phone calls. So on my campus, I have a really robust nursing program, and I've worked closely with them, and I found that I really liked a lot of the patient-driven models that they use. And so you have 4 examples here. We're going to zoom in and look at 2 of them closely in a minute, but we like to present options, and so that you can get something out of today's training that really speaks to you. If you think of healthcare, they're delivering information to patients and families. They are often delivering tough news to hear. And so these models take into consideration the health and well-being of the people sitting before them, the treatment that they may have received just thus far, the condition that they're dealing with, and also you're trying to leave them with some action steps. What is it that we want them to do to heal, to cope, to be resilient in the face of whatever the news is being delivered? So I really like healthcare models, and we're going to look at 2 in some detail. And so here you have Steele's communication cycle. This is a model developed by Kaylee Steele, and it is a circle, it is a cycle, it is continuous, and it is like the empathy mapping, but it's just a different way to visualize this. And it's calling for us to be empathetic, to maintain eye contact, to slow down, take those breaths, to tell the truth and tell it directly. And so here is a space I want to have us pause on the ways in which we sometimes try to build rapport, knowing that we have to deliver some tough news. Do not spend too much time having really superficial or shallow level small talk with the people when they come in. You do want to be kind, but you need to keep in mind that they know they're coming in for what's going to be an uncomfortable or tough meeting. They're coming in with uncertainty. Certainly, I want you to make kind gestures, welcome them, try to ensure they have a comfortable place to sit, that they have room to maneuver. And if you can offer them coffee, tea, or water, that can be really, really useful. But if you spend too much time talking to them about, say, the weather, or asking how they've been, if you know that they are been having a tough time, that can actually raise anxiety level and make the meeting more difficult for them because they really just want you to get straight to it. So you want to take some time building rapport, but really get to the truth and say it clearly and say it plainly and prepare to say it earlier than you might expect. So when we're thinking about ourselves, we think, oh, I have to deliver this tough news. And in our mind, even though we know differently, we think the meeting will be over when I get that tough news out of my mouth, right? Or if I get it on paper. But we have a lot of work to do after the straightforward delivery of that news if we want it to be handled as well as possible. And so this model just keeps us in that cycle, has us observing the scene, surveying body language, enables us to pause and ask questions, or have them ask questions, and so that we spend time ensuring that they do understand the information that they've been given, but ensuring that there's some stability afterwards before we cut the meeting off and send them on their way. And so perhaps this is a visual that you keep around, thinking of it as a cycle that may be repeated several times during one conversation. Spikes could be a model you're familiar with. It is often used in healthcare for delivering a terminal diagnosis. And for some of you, that might seem dramatic, but a lot of victim advocates and people involved in responding to sexual misconduct, law enforcement officers, they sometimes use a similar model. They might have a different acronym for it. So this one is SPIKES, where you want to set up, convey some seriousness. And this is why, if we think about what I was just saying with the other model, talking too much about the weather or about holidays or about your outfit or their outfit, right, at some length that's going to feel insincere and like you're avoiding the topic at hand. And so there's really a lot of good reasoning for conveying some seriousness of the meeting. You don't want to appear so serious that you're making them think the news is going to be worse than it is, but you don't want to miscommunicate by your tone or your demeanor. You want them to feel able to ask you questions, for them to pause. We want them to comprehend the material. I know that the policy on my campus is very legalistic. I'm one of many lawyers who helped write the policy, so I'm not trying to call out lawyers. We have our role to play. I like my policy, but would I quote it directly in meetings? Not necessarily. We can rely upon our policy language because we know it's safe. We know it's vetted. This is a compliance landscape. This is high liability work that we do. But are we serving our community if we stick to those legalistic phrases and it's not landing in a way that the person that we're talking to can comprehend? I would argue no. If you can't make your policy in plain language or more user-friendly or more student-friendly, hopefully you can make your conversational language around your policy decisions more easily and more readily understood. And so that's key in the middle of a model like this. You want to give facts. You want to deliberately allow time for it to land. This is a good place to pause. This is a good place to take a breath. This is a good place to remind them of the support resources that remain available, to ask them if they have a support network, ask them what they're going to do when they leave your office. This gives them a concrete plan of action. We don't want them receiving what they interpret as bad news and then wandering aimlessly with no idea of what to do next. And so we sometimes, if we know it's going to be very devastating, might have a person sitting outside the office, might have contacted our counseling center and ensured that they were taking walk-ins following the meeting. We try to use our calendars constructively, so we don't deliver particularly bad news after 3 o'clock on a Friday. There are steps that you can take. Again, what's in your control, considering the place and the feelings and the well-being of the person on the other side of the dialogue, that can really structure these meetings for greater success.
Thank you, Cara. So I'm going to bring us back to the context in which we do this work, and specifically the Title IX regulations and guidance that sometimes adds pressure to us, but also what I highlight here with a school needing to designate and authorize at least one employee to coordinate the efforts of compliance with Title IX. For those on the call who may be coordinators or deputy coordinators, I think this authorization is an important tool to keep in mind. We need to have, and hopefully on your campus, you have some degree of autonomy to be able to set boundaries, or you have a team of people who can help you with that boundary setting. As Cara referenced earlier, the potential of some of the pain points or pressure points where dialogue becomes difficult because of the circumstances. And when we think about our internal constituents, whether it's our general counsel or whoever our advising authority may be, if it's an external partner or a team of folks on campus, if you're on a campus that has a strong athletics program or has organizational leaders that have social capital, other partners in the process who you're working with, those internal constituents, one of the things to think about is how do we set boundaries to prepare for some of those difficult dialogue. One, again, from a preparation stage is when you know who these folks are, if we can have a conversation about what to expect in conversation before there is a pressure point at hand, that can sometimes help. Having some dialogue with partners before there's a need to talk about an issue helps give us a little bit of sense of what our rapport is with those other folks, which can help us then use one of these communication models to think about how are my exchanges with this person sometimes triggering to me in different ways, and how do we do that? I am not an attorney, but I work with lots of attorneys, and I experience in this field sometimes that can be a pressure point. If I came to this work out of student affairs and conduct or from an advocacy lens, when I'm sitting in the room with someone who is coming at this from having been and being an attorney who's thinking about the legal and liability and all of the what feels sometimes disconnected or liability driven, that in and of itself can be a tension point. And so thinking about, is it the conversation that's a difficult dialogue, or is it the context and the people I'm communicating with that may be contributing? And it is sometimes a complex matter of, it involves all of that. But the more you can prepare and think about how you can control what you can control, your own experience in the process. Similarly, when we're looking at external constituents, whether it's parents or advisors, roommates and neighbors who may want to talk about what a good person this is and you're not being fair, all of these are not just points of difficult dialogue, but roles that might raise the potential for difficult dialogue, and thinking both about how am I preparing for those boundaries? How am I setting myself up to be able to say, this isn't a conversation about me, this is a conversation about my role, and these are the boundaries, and here's why. So sometimes we can take it from an emotional conversation to the really factual information that can help to steer a conversation back into that really setting and holding of boundaries. But when we're already stressed and emotional and we've got 6 other things to do, so our focus is distracted, the really deconstructing these sorts of things before the need arises can make it easier. Or as I think Cara mentioned earlier, I'm sure a number of us have our Post-it note or our picture up on the wall that has the 1 or 2 words that is our go-to of, I have one that literally is a Chinese brushstroke that says, "Breathe, you are alive." And sometimes just looking at that reminds you to take a breath and come back to, I've prepared for this. I know what I'm doing. I have the information that I need. So again, recognizing the nature of the work that we do, enhanced with the current state we're in, with new regulations that, barring any sort of injunction, or need to be going into effect on August 14th. That in and of itself is a lot. How can we plan and prepare to better walk into what we know are going to be difficult conversations? Again, other points across communication that can be challenging when we talk about the intake process of thoroughly explaining options that are available for both supportive measures and filing a complaint, decision points throughout the process where either we're making a decision, delivering information about a decision, or we're being asking parties involved to make a decision. Those can each be points that are inherently delivering difficult dialogue. And so thinking at each of these points, how do we prepare for having all the tools we need? And how do I prepare myself to respond effectively? Really is again, giving ourselves the time or the luxury to think about those what ifs before we're actually in the moment of, on a schedule, they're due here any minute, or they're here and they're not understanding me and I've got another meeting to get to. That's a hard time to draw on all of this. But before you get to these difficult points, if you think a bit about, where am I feeling reaction and what might I do differently to control what I can control? We are hopeful that this gives some things to think about and some models that might be useful to put into effect. We will again take a pause and think about that deep breath to come back into the moment. We shared in a PDF that Carrie provided a number of different case scenarios, but we thought that we might share on the screen one of those case scenarios and think about what a response might be like in kind of unpacking what sorts of emotional or reactive circumstance it would be, and how one of these models could be used to navigate or reduce the potential for emotion in that exchange. So as you may still be reading this, this particular scenario, likely common experience for many of us, an early or little lie investigation stage, someone has come forward with a concern and they've provided witnesses who either aren't being responsive when the reporting party thought they might, or what they have to share isn't helpful for providing additional information to move forward. So the point of, we know that this is going to be difficult for Tanya to hear. that Tanya says, I know this happened. I'm pretty sure I know who the person is. I just don't know their name. These witnesses, they're going to tell you, they're going to make it known. They're going to help us do something to hold that person accountable. Cara, I'm going to turn to you.
Sure. I can tell you how I would handle this. If Tanya walked into my office, my wonderful administrative assistant Heidi is so kind. So I feel very confident she would have been offered coffee, tea, or water. But if she had to wait for me at all, I would come out and say, hi, Tanya, and say, I trust you've been offered something to drink. She should say yes, and I am. I'm totally confident in my staff that they do that, but it's just another gesture, And so then I say, well, come on in and have a seat and, give Tanya time to sit down. But then I would make a compassionate face and say, Tanya, we reached out to the witnesses that you told us about. I said that all but one declined to come in, and the one who's come in told us that they really don't recall many details, and so at this time I don't have the information that we would need to move forward. Then I'd ask Tanya, I was like, is there anyone else you think that we might talk to? It's important that you want to convey that you're committed to continuing to look into that. And if Tanya doesn't have anyone else, I would say very compassionately that, like, okay, well, if we don't have additional information, I don't have a way forward for the investigation, but we remain committed to supporting you. Are there any supportive measures? And then I would walk through them, right? So I would walk through academic or housing, any of the flexibility that you regularly offer, safety on campus. We have campus safety escorts. We have the Center for Student Wellbeing and counseling services, and I would walk through that menu. But then before I would conclude the meeting, I would say that, if she remembers anything else, if, a friend comes up and tells her that they witnessed something, we would be happy to talk to them, right? That we don't, on my campus, have a statute of limitations, and that closing the case doesn't mean it was a one chance and that we couldn't reopen it. And I wouldn't even close it that day or tell Tanya that I'm closing it. I would say that, like, we will pause for now. If more information comes to light, if there's anything else you think that would be helpful for us to know, please reach out to us. And then I would ask Tanya what she would want future communication from my office to look like, because if we wanted to check back in a week or two, we would be willing to do that. And so you're conveying that kindness and compassion and a willingness to keep working on the case, but you have offered the information that she needed in a really straightforward way, and then supported it with some supportive measures and action steps, so that hopefully Tanya feels heard and that her needs were met, and that the person who's relaying this information to her really does care.
Cara, I love two things. As I heard you talk through that, I could kind of hear your words following the cycle of steel model that you talked about. And I also recognize that Cara just presented a lovely example of when everything goes super smoothly, because yes, it's a difficult circumstance, but here are all of the options. So when we complicate things, when Tanya is either emotional in an irate perspective, I can't believe you didn't get the answer, there has to be more information, of course they're going to tell you, make them come talk to you, or conversely is emotional of just tears and can't get a breath, that can sometimes be something that it's hard to suggest other options to someone who is either yelling or crying or expressing emotion. So thinking through, how do we sit with the emotion as opposed to react to the emotion, and identify and likely have in our toolbox already, I really can't get through explaining all of the options. So maybe what I do is I derail off of that cycle and say, I know how hard this is. Is there someone that I can connect you with? Did you want me to connect you with a counselor? Whatever your institutional response might be to someone who is overwhelmed in that way, but also I'm going to send you some follow-up information. So maybe the things you would have liked to have delivered verbally, you can now provide in writing because the circumstances changed. And I think that's part of any of these models is how do you pay attention to and adapt to whatever's in front of you. There's an element of flexibility. So as much as we want to be prepared, we also need to be prepared to step away from the original plan and respond effectively to whatever's happening in front of us. So this is one of several case scenarios that were provided. I think we envision a couple of things as you play with some of these models to see what fits and what you might take away from any one of these or several of these models. It can help to play with how would you apply a model to this particular scenario and have a couple of different scenarios to choose from. Some of you who work in teams might find it useful to use the scenarios as some points of discussion to get a sense of how other people would approach the similar situation, and then thinking about how different communication styles or the use of different communication models might work differently depending upon who the folks are within the team, both their role and personality wise of what folks bring in. So we hope that scratches the surface and gives some ideas of how to use this information in other training or other conversations as you develop staff on your own campus or working with colleagues regionally on these matters. We also wanted to share some information about an equally important point of how we communicate throughout our process, again, in writing or verbally, when we are interacting because something happened, as well as the presence that we put forward in training and other opportunities where the need is not there. Jennifer Freed has written quite a bit about institutional betrayal. When someone experiences some form of trauma, she writes predominantly around sexual violence, but she's applied this in other settings. And with other issues. Institutional betrayal is someone comes forward to an institution or an organization whose intention is to help them, and the response does further damage or perpetuates the harm. That's institutional betrayal. The person or the organization that was supposed to help me wasn't helpful, and that made the trauma worse. It's an important concept. Hopefully you have heard about it. She's also spent a great deal more time recently talking about institutional courage. So what does it look like when we get it right? And again, in the current landscape, we're seeing a lot of this of how we respond when bad things happen comes down to institutional courage. She's written a lot about institutional courage in the face of acknowledging and sincere apologies for systems that weren't working for folks with regard to sexual violence. And I have an example this week of response to the protests that are happening and the underlying incidents of George Floyd and others. There have been a number of analyses of how different organizations and institutions have responded, and those whose words were helpful and those who are really getting raked over social media because they missed the mark in their responses. I think for an example of institutional courage, I would point to the president of Emerson College, who self-describes in his response that he's an African-American male, and he writes very passionately about his experiences, just how angry he is. And he ended his message by saying, "My message today is I'm angry, and I'll come back with a message when I can say more than that." And it struck me because, wow, that took a lot of courage to acknowledge I don't have the answer. I am sitting in my emotion right now. And I share that as an example of institutional courage, but to emphasize everything that we do can often feel like it's under a microscope, but we have the potential to avoid engaging in behaviors that could be institutional betrayal and to model institutional courage. Cara, you want to take this one?
Sure. So if you don't want to read all of her research on this, there is a very helpful 2 to 3 page summary out there. I think we linked to this in the materials, but her 10 principles for institutions are drawn from that shorter reading. And some of this we're doing, some of this is not comfortable for all of our institutions. Some of this we're getting there, but I mean, I can tell you just firsthand, I built the center that I run on this research, and the students in my institution, faculty and staff, do trust my center. And now in many ways, admittedly, I don't have to deliver outcomes and sanctions. And we did have a high profile incident on my campus. We were really confronted with a time period of distrust. And so when I came into my role, I was like, how am I going to do this? This was really, really tough time for my campus community. And so I offer this in that vein that this worked really well for me. And when my institution adopts these approaches, we really are able to build bridges across identities and across, you know, problematic histories in certain areas. And so certainly you need to comply with the law, right? But compliance is a floor. Compliance is what we have to do. We certainly can do more. And if you want to have trust built in your community and you want there to be some time to react, some time to formulate a plan, you've got to have that trust that they know what you're doing. And so certainly you start with compliance, but you need to have the right people in the roles. You need to respond sensitively. You need to start by receiving the information and not launching straight into an investigation or interrogation. You want to bear witness to the harms that are occurring in our communities. And you know, this matters wherever they happen in the world, wherever your campus geography lands or is drawn, regardless of whether or not these harms are going to be addressed under the new Title IX procedures. You can bear witness, you can be accountable, and this is really hard for some of us, and many of our lawyers or risk management offices would discourage us from apologizing, but it's very powerful. And institutions are starting to do that. And maybe you can't apologize for everything, but where you can apologize, the words "I'm sorry" make a huge difference. We're actually seeing this in medical malpractice, and it is, I hope, sincere, but it is also resulting in fewer lawsuits against institutions. And so this is a different way of doing things that may be tough to embrace where you are, but there's some really powerful data behind it. Not to mention, sometimes the apologies are just really owed and warranted. Cherish your whistleblowers. This sometimes means cherishing the difficult people on our campuses, but they're trying to help you. They're trying to tell you that something isn't going wrong, or something is going wrong, and that we're not treating people with care and dignity. And again, if we would embrace the feedback before they need to feel like they have to actually blow the whistle in a public way, this is going to give you an opportunity to correct or address gaps in our communities or in our procedures. Engage in self-study. We've made some progress here because many of us are doing more assessment than ever before. Many of us are doing campus climate surveys, but you also need to conduct anonymous surveys. And that may vary by your population. I'll tell you that we did a staff survey at an institution I was working with a few months ago, and the staff did not trust the link to be fully protected and anonymous. And so a lot of our messaging then was the data is held by the third-party offsite vendor. And here's the information that you can read about that. That's where the trust or lack thereof was. And so that messaging may be really important. If you take anonymous complaints, and I encourage you to do so, you need to promote that method, that mechanism, and that link. They shouldn't have to dig through it and find it in like deep in an HR policy, like maybe you have Ethics Point or some other provider that isn't a vendor that has been copied onto a lot of old documents. Make sure that that gets promoted out there, because people are wanting to tell us what's going on and what's going wrong. And we should want to receive that information, and we should act on it where we can. If your leadership or whoever your spokespeople are going to be speaking about sexual misconduct, sexual assault, sexual violence, it's very important that they are at least briefed on current statistics and contemporary language. Many of us growing up, going through junior high and high school, did not get what I would consider to be comprehensive or even necessarily accurate education on these topics. And I don't expect for everyone in a role that is asking them to address other things throughout the day to be well versed. But if they're going to speak out, if they're going to take meetings and issue statements, it's very important that they have been educated. Hopefully, you might have heard us say this before, but this new final rule that is issued might be an opportunity for you to get some people back in training who you haven't seen in a while. The headlines are useful in this respect because they're really sensationalized, acting like it's going to be an overhaul or there's a lot of training. Use that as a hook to get some of these senior leaders back and revisiting the issue of sexual misconduct. It will really improve the dialogues that they have around these issues. Be as transparent as you can. This has been tough for some institutions. It really depends on the politics, the internal politics and the framework where you are. I know that institutions vary widely and different state laws require different levels of transparency of different institutions, but where you can, release data and make your policies and procedures visible. You should do that. It builds trust. People want to see what they can about how you're handling things. And so some schools issue very comprehensive reports in which they are summarizing each individual incident. Some schools just do a brief data release that has aggregated a lot of the data. And I urge you where you can to land at least somewhere in between. Your institutions have resources. Now more than ever, we're being asked to do what we can where we are with what we've got. And so the models, the prevention models that we use, often the socio-ecological model, but really any of them are highlighting that the individual has a role to play, that we exist in interpersonal relationships with others, and then there is the power of the community. And sometimes we have smaller communities within our larger communities, and then there is the institution or society at large. And they hold a lot of influence, they hold a lot of sway, they have a platform, they have visibility. So if we're truly going to combat the issue, it takes more than just your prevention professionals. It takes more than just the Title IX coordinators on your campus. It really does take the power of the institution. And she walks through examples of that in her longer articles. And then it takes resources. So we have to go beyond lip service. You have to have people who have time and who have money and who have staff to help them engage in the behavior. And so like everything else, it becomes a continuous cycle. But schools and other programs that have adopted this model have really strong success stories that hopefully inspire you, but also can then help you make the case for more resources, whatever your role on your campus.
Thanks, Cara. I think one of the things I really appreciate Jennifer Freed's work around all of this, but one of the things that's helpful with this list and some of the more recent work around institutional courage is it aligns with the need, even more so today as we're in the midst of a pandemic that is affecting higher education just in so many significant ways. Campuses are very attuned to crisis communication and the PR aspect of what we do. The research that's been done by Jennifer Freed and by others using her models give some interesting tools as we go back to what I said earlier as a coordinator or a deputy coordinator, having conversation with folks who may hold authority in different ways from you, whether it's your general counsel or other senior leadership, sometimes looking to why is this important is not just because I do the work and I know this is going to make a difference, but to be able to tie it to some of the institutional betrayal literature that uses examples that you're like, oh my gosh, I've seen that. And they write out in a research and empirically supported way how the studies have shown that that has adverse impact on the individual and potentially for the organization. And so you can get some data-driven ways to help build the argument. And often with some of the communication models, when you know it's going to be difficult because you're asking for resources that you know this is a tough time to ask for resources, or you're trying to push back on a general counsel who may think the language is fine and you're trying to soften the language because of recognizing how it's going to be received. Sometimes getting caught up in the emotional exchange of my experience versus the other person's experience can get us into a loop that isn't helpful. If we can pull in, I've looked into it and there's this article that really highlights how this helps or hinders, that can be a useful tool, some of the preparation for our communication. Broadly speaking, and kind of hopefully tying all of this together, when we think about how information is conveyed, we have so much information that we have to share on a regular basis. We hope proactively to share information with our community so they know where to go, they know what behavioral expectations are, they know how to get help. Are we doing that in a way that it reaches our audience and doesn't incite constituents within the group? When we think about our policy and process, how is that being made available? And is it really accessible in every sense of that word? What other resource information and links? And do we have a mechanism in place to continually make sure those links are live, they're going to the right place, they're getting the information that's needed? Thinking about tutorial or tips for the use of technology. That's now another thing that is a requirement of some training under the new regulations, but in general, setting expectations for folks on our team and the folks that we support or serve so that we demystify anything we can is going to make the conversations we have easier. The supporting information that might be complementary to these difficult dialogues. Sometimes it's a flowchart or a timeline, something you can point to when there's also lots of stress or emotion, something concrete to help convey, or some folks are more visual, or it might be easier for me to remember by some piece of takeaway information, and the ever important making sure that there is direct contact information on everything that goes out, whether that's an alias of Title IX at whatever institution.edu, or if it is a person's name. All of these tools can help to extend. We hope we communicate really well in those difficult dialogues, but giving folks the takeaway or making sure we've done some setup can help the entire experience of communication. Again, I feel like in some cases we leave folks in these conversations with as many questions as answers, but our hope and intention today was that we provided some tools for folks to continue to think about and find the tools that might help both individually, what can I control in my own responses and reactions and preparation, and how can I help the folks that I work with to use some of these tools and to think together, particularly as we approach the time of year where many of us are reviewing the past year, what worked, what didn't work, what can we improve upon, and how do we begin to rethink what needs to be adjusted, both from a policy and procedure written document perspective, and how we do our work and setting up our tools for a successful year ahead. I'm going to pause there. Cara, any final words? And we'll certainly look and see if there are any questions in the chat box.
No final words, just thank you for your time today. And if I can ever be of assistance, do not hesitate to reach out.
Well, thank you, Cara and Amy. I am not seeing any questions come through in the chat box, but there is still time if you would like to pose a question to one of our presenters today. Thank you for all the tools and resources that you guys have provided. Many different models to consider, especially as we prepare for the upcoming school year, and any number of level of difficult dialogues that we will be having. So seeing no questions and hearing people move on to their next part of their day. I just want to thank you both again for all the work and time that you have given both to this workshop and the previous one, and just for the work you continue to do respectively outside of Ohio. So thank you for being a part of our efforts, and I hope you all have a wonderful day and take care.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.